Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Training Program on Climate Change, Adaptation and Mitigation. Today is the third day of this training program. I am Dr. Shanghamitra Adho, Associate Professor in Geography, Kollani Mohavidyalaya, India, is very happy and feel honored to invite Dr. Scott Carlin, Associate Professor in Geography, Long Island University, New York, USA. He is the main speaker at this training program on climate change, and we know that Dr. He is a terrific speaker, and our participants will gain much from your talk on climate change. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And the topic I will introduce today is human development, climate change, and our healthy planet. I want to first acknowledge my Long Island University Honors College students that are on the call with us today. And I'm encouraging everybody to use the chat feature so you can introduce yourself and share so that we have some nice interchange. It may not be as much interaction verbally as we'd all like because time is tight, but it would be good to share your thoughts, especially internationally. And thank you for acknowledging our different time zones as we do this wonderful Zoom event today from one part of the world to halfway around the world to join together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about my own personal background, but I thought I would just share this little snippet. I have the pleasure to do a lot of work at the United Nations in addition to my teaching obligations with Long Island University. This is an organization I've worked with for many years, and it's the Global NGO Executive Committee. For the last 2 years, until this past fall, I was serving as their second vice president and helping with their strategic planning process. And they work closely with a UN agency called the Department of Global Communications, and they run periodic international conferences that I've also been very actively involved in helping to shape over many years now. So there are many topics I want to introduce to you today, and I apologize for overloading you with information, but I can also make available my slides if you'd like those distributed to all the guests. So we can discuss that later as well as an option. You also have the ability to do screenshots for information for later review. So the UN Human Development Index is produced by UNDP, the development program. They just came out with a new report yesterday on human security that's very important to our work today. So I'm going to start with an introduction to that. As part of my comments, I'm going to talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goals 7 and 13. And part of that is the very important UN Paris Agreement. The nations of the world recently revisited the Paris Agreement from 2015 at the COP26 conference in Scotland. So I'll say a little bit about that, all of which is framed in the context of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So let me just share right now at the outset that we want to mitigate climate. We want to reduce the possibility of future impacts by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and taking other mitigation strategies. We also want to adjust and adapt to climate change. All the countries of the world, all the cities and communities have to become more resilient. We all have to learn these skills of resiliency. So I'll share a little bit about climate adaptation as well today. And lastly, I'm going to talk about a very important project called the Social Progress Index to wrap up my comments today. So the report that was released yesterday was about human security. And you can see in this graphic on the slide the dimensions that have been identified by international experts as important domains of human security, and health, environment, food, economics, many of these, if not all these dimensions, are going to be affected by climate change. So this context of human security that the UNDP focuses on also includes a healthy focus on climate change, as we'll see in the next few minutes. This is the countries that have done best on the Human Development Index ranking system that is done by the United Nations. And you can see that there's a number of countries in Europe that do quite well in this ranking. And you can see some of the variables they use to create this index score. That includes life expectancy, expected years of schooling, and the average years of schooling that is completed across each nation, in addition to information about gross national income. So they aggregate different indicators like this together to get a single index score. This is what happened to that index score for the countries of the world, all averaged together under COVID. We've seen very steady progress in the Human Development Index dating back to 1990, according to this graph. And we see the most pronounced kind of fall off from that progress during the years of COVID. So this is of great concern to all of us around the world. And it also speaks to this question of resiliency. We know this kind of disturbance pattern is going to be with us as climate change worsens in coming years and decades. And so this resiliency strategy of how do we bounce back, or as my president puts it, bounce back better following these setbacks, is a core part of what we all as students and faculty and professionals need to focus on in coming years. This is the press release that was released yesterday at the United Nations on this new report that I'd like to update you on. So this is hot off the press's information in terms of this important new study analyzing new threats to human security in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a new term that reflects human impacts on the entire planet. We are a planet-shaping species now. The Anthropocene is a technical term introduced by geologists to capture the qualitative shifts that are happening on our planet. Officially, we have not entered the Anthropocene. That's something that geologists would meet and convene on and formally adopt, but it is at the proposal stage and is being under active consideration as an official terminology. So to start us off today, I wanted you to each take a moment to reflect and hopefully start to use the chat feature. Maybe you want to pick one of these questions and just jot an answer into the chat window. What does human security mean to you? Does that mean a job? Does that mean a comfortable home? What are the attributes that you attach to human security? Because climate change is very much about threats to our human security. This is some of the core ways in which we feel threatened by these proposed changes. Which human security threats do you worry the most about? Again, that might be economic, it might be political, it might be religious, it could be anything that you choose to put down. There's no wrong answers here. This is just your personal opinion. I should add that the UN Development Program is actually requesting answers to these questions. So if you go to the website for this new report, and you'll see the title of that report repeatedly presented to you in upcoming slides. Thank you, Doctor, for that answer. Food, clothes, housing, education, and jobs are human security. Excellent. I'd love to see more answers to that before I proceed forward, but I'm going to proceed, folks. I've got a lot of information to share. So as you're coming up with answers, just keep popping those answers into the chat window, please. There are no wrong answers. It's just an opportunity to really introduce yourself to this wonderful international community we've created today. What do you think is needed to improve human security in your community and worldwide. So that's kind of more aspirational. What are you hoping to see in the future? So I'm going to proceed forward, but I do hope you use that chat window. I'd like to use this slide as a context for today. This comes from this new report, again, released yesterday, and it's framing how the UN is thinking about this question of human security. And as the report does, I too want to assert that we have to place more attention to solidarity. So protection means we want to be protected from the ill effects of climate change. Protection means we want to live in peaceful societies. We want to be protected from the scourge of war. Empowerment means we want an education. We want to be able to do the things that matter to us in life, and we want the skills that are required to be successful at that. And all of those things give us agency in the world. But it's important now, as we're kind of heading deeper into this 21st century, for us to recognize the 21st century is going to require new forms of solidarity for us to be successful in securing our human security. And again, this is a theme that will kind of run through my presentation this morning. The new slide here, the new graph here is a little complicated, but it's not that hard to digest. So we have on the x-axis the Human Development Index, and countries are segmented into low performing countries, medium performing countries, high and very high performing countries. On the y-axis, we see the index of planetary pressures. So the very high Human Development Index countries are also the countries that are placing the most pressure on the resources of the planet, including its climate system. This, I want to assert, is very perverse. It's an outcome of historic processes that we understand very well. Very high HDIs use more fossil fuel energy per capita than other countries. But now we're in the situation that the countries that we are all striving to emulate, like the European countries that were on the slide before, very high life longevity, very high income, we can't all emulate them. We're only going to accelerate these planetary pressures, including climate change. In fact, it's the low and medium HDI countries that we should be emulating in terms of their planetary pressures. So we have to reinvent in your lifetime, in the next 25 years, the goals of what we're trying to do to achieve human security and human prosperity. And I want to assert, and I think this report does a nice job of asserting, that our collective solidarity, our global solidarity, is in fact critical to that effort. So this is just a little bit more information about how different countries break out in terms of the Human Development Index. So like just repeating the same information like life expectancy, years of schooling, GNI are tabulated together to form this index. And here we see a little bit more additional information on the same theme. So we have the index of planetary pressure, and we're given now a kind of vertical axis bar in terms of how countries are performing vertically with respect to planetary pressures in each of these respective HDI groupings in the first graphic. And in the second graphic, the y-axis notes the number of additional extreme temperature days above average. So now we get, some additional information here. The countries that are performing at the low end are having the least impact on planetary pressure, yet they are feeling the most impact when measured in terms of extreme temperature days. And those that are at the very high end of the scale are in some ways perversely, having the least amount of impact from extreme temperature days. So the pressures to reform are less severe by this one measure for those that need to reform the fastest, those at the very high HDI. Climate change is expected to affect people's ability to work. The slides I'm all sharing are all coming from this report just released yesterday. It's a fascinating study. So the Arab states, with their rising temperatures in environments that are already very hot, are going to be impacted by this. And this occurs more severely under a future scenario of very high emissions, which we're all trying to avoid. And it does occur with less severity under a moderate emission scenario. But still, those changes are disconcerting. So one of the themes that we won't have enough time to explore today, but I do want to share is very important to my own professional work, is the relationship between climate and health. I'm actually focused on a project in the New York area looking at children's environmental health and using environmental health as a learning lens for empowering our youth. So the relationships between climate and health is something that I do pay a fair amount of attention to personally, and I do encourage each of you to be more mindful of the news reports and to kind of learn how this is a rapidly changing field. The single most important metric I'm going to share today is the idea that we need to constrain temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we can see from this chart that as we move away from that, as we fail to secure that future goal, if that were to happen this century, the impacts are uniformly quite poor, and in many cases catastrophic. So as we get to 4 degrees Celsius, we know that these become really a context for social breakdown. Extreme heat, extreme rainfall, and crop drought all accelerate as these temperature scenarios get worse. So the international community in the Paris Climate Agreement, adopted in 2015, very closely around the same time as the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that agreement stipulates we should really strive for this 1.5 degree goal. This is the distribution of death caused by climate change based on scenarios for 2080 to 2099 under a high carbon, high Celsius scenario. And this slide, again from the same report, happens to spotlight both the United States and the Asian realm, including South Asia. And we can see how devastating a high temperature scenario later this century would be for mortality risk in both the United States and in the Indian subcontinent. Similarly, countries will face additional water shortages this century. And we see that countries that do poorly on gender issues, they have a high gender gap, there's inequalities among the genders, are likely to fare worse in terms of water shortages and also the Human Development Index. So this is a context for us as a global community, again, to pull together, show solidarity, and create new innovative practices so that we work together to reduce these gender gaps, reduce these future water shortages using new technologies, and also transform our performance on the HDI index. here we see some very interesting and alarming information. Again, looking at the very high emissions scenario, we see that climate change deaths will rival those of some of the main causes of death today. So in the Arab states, climate deaths could equal the deaths the Arab states currently face from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other main causes of death today. I'm not of the belief that we're likely to see that very high emission scenario. But I am also aware that we have not entirely ruled that out as a global community. So we are trending away in our policy changes from this high emission scenario. This is kind of a business as usual scenario. We don't have to pay attention to climate change at all. And that's not how the world is acting. The moderate emission scenario is, in fact, a higher probability. And we have to be very careful about avoiding those impacts as well. They're not as severe on this graph, but still they're quite high, and they should be troubling as well. I'm going to skip this slide, actually. So my students were just learning about systems dynamics and the way we have to kind of unpack the world in different kinds of ways today. That we can't think of the world in the old model of linear thinking, that we extract resources, consume resources, and dispose of resources, the old linear economy. We have to think in terms of ecosystems. We have to think in terms of systems. We have to think in terms of a circular economy. And one of the images we were talking about in class on Monday was this iceberg model that is used by systems theorists to understand not only what we see in the world, but the many layers that are hidden from us. And that is our obligation, particularly at the university level, to understand, to unpack, and to reveal so that we can move forward and improve public health, not just in our own country, but internationally. So the issue of femicide, which is a problem in many developing countries, and is a lesser problem, but still an issue in the United States, my country. It has its roots in a whole series of other layers here. And we just saw on the prior slide that inequalities in gender are in fact linked to future problems with water distribution. So this slide captures the kinds of dynamics that I've been introducing using this brand new report from UNDP. We have very dangerous planetary changes that are taking place right now, and those are increasingly coupled to human security crises. So in order to tackle the human security crises, we are required to understand and address planetary changes. And this word Anthropocene means we must do that together. We must plan for the future as a global community. I'd like that to be as democratically as possible, and I'll say more about that in this presentation. Okay, so with that as a very long introduction, I'm going to kind of move forward a little more efficiently through a bunch of different topics. First, what needs to be done, and get into the weeds a little bit on climate mitigation. And then what can we do? How do we act through our agency and be empowered so that we can act as transforming agents to improve the world? And that agency is not for the leaders of our government. Agency in the 21st century means each and every one of us has our role to play, because the leaders of the world, they have power, but it's not unlimited power. They depend upon our leadership as well. A very important person recently passed, someone who I had planned to talk about with my students this semester before his passing. He's a famous Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, and he coined this term interbeing. And interbeing is a Buddhist perspective on interdependence. It's an ecological or process-oriented view of life. We are not truly separate people. It's a very odd statement to try to process. We are not truly separate people. We are only here because of other living beings. That's the only way we can subsist. We are the air we breathe, the food we eat. Without our interdependence with the world, we would perish. Interbeing can be seen as a pathway for cultivating our human solidarity and our global citizenship. Our life becomes an opportunity to be of service to others and all of life on Earth. So I want to invite you on the ambitious goal of embracing solidarity with other people, but embracing solidarity with all life on the planet, being global citizens, being ecological citizens. This gives us a very high-level look at what we're trying to do as a human species, working collectively together. Our new path started in 2015 with this Paris Agreement. 2020, people are arguing, this is a slightly dated slide, people are arguing, this is our turning point, this is where we come together. This is how we make strides forward. We're still at that turning point moment. We're still trying to kind of turn the corner on this. And it's quite serious. We really do need to turn the corner on this yesterday. So we are several steps behind now, especially as measured relative to these UN Sustainable Development Goals that will expire in 2030. We are off pace to achieve a lot of these goals because we have not reached that critical turning point just yet. And we're doing all of this in a climate context to reach a goal of net zero emissions. We don't literally have to get down to zero emissions, but we need to be at net zero. So the trees will pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We may have technologies that can do that as well. So there can be some emissions into the atmosphere, but we have to be in balance, homeostasis with the planet by 2050. So this gives us a little bit of texture. I'm not going to kind of get into the weeds of all the different technologies and policy changes that are needed. So this gives us a sampling of some of the changes that are being proposed to set us on our way to net zero. For example, the icon for transport says zero emission transport is the preferred form of all new mobility in the world's major cities. So electric cars, electric motorcycles, scooters, all of those new sales should be now electric today. We're not there yet as a global community. We're not even close to that. But it is where we need to point as the next goal in order to get to this important goal of net zero. What happens is the further we keep pushing out these milestones, it means the rate of change has to accelerate all the faster. And it becomes much more challenging for us as nations, as cities, and the world to achieve this net zero goal and the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal by this century. So these are the specific goals attached to the SDG 13, Sustainable Development Goal 13, climate action, calls for strengthening resilience and adaptations to climate. It calls for measuring this kinds of change and integrating measurements into national policies and planning. It calls for improving education and awareness raising around climate change. We need to implement financial changes in the world in order to secure this. I will talk more about that. And we need capacities for planning for those that have less resources, particularly for adaptation among marginalized populations. Those might be women, youth, or other marginalized communities. Similarly, we have SDG 7, which is to pursue clean energy strategies. I'm not going to read through all of these goals as well, the specific targets for SDG 7, but basically we're pushing towards a future of renewable energy, and we have a long way to go to get there. And there are still important technological hurdles. What happens when the sun doesn't shine is commonly reported in our newspapers. Will we have backup capacity in batteries? How exactly do we do that? Do we turn on the old power plants when the sun doesn't shine? We can't do that. That's going backwards in terms of our goals. But the technological fit for all this is still absolutely a work in progress. Scientists are optimistic, engineers are optimistic, but the devil is always in the details, as the saying goes. There are 17 SDGs. Just as the world needs solidarity across its national borders, we have to think in multi-dimensional terms. We all understand that climate change has many different impacts. I've mentioned health, I've mentioned access to water. It will impact our food, it will impact global migration, it will impact war. So we need to see these UN Sustainable Development Goals as intertwined with each other, just as our lives are intertwined coming from America and India. All of these 17 goals need to be in our thoughts moving forward. There's a project that was launched from the United States. It's an international project called Drawdown Solutions. And they identified that one of the most effective strategies in the world for tackling climate change is SDG number 5, gender equality. There's very few things we can do that would be more cost effective than ensuring that all girls get an education, which is also SDG 4. That's difficult to even comprehend. One of the most effective strategies we can do is gender empowerment. I've mentioned gender about 3 or 4 times now, if you haven't caught that theme yet. So there's many aspects of gender that relate to climate change in ways that the engineers and the scientists weren't thinking about 20 years ago, but now are on the table in terms of our discussions. Sustainable cities, industrial planning, many different interconnections among all these goals, especially economic inequality. So here's some iconic information spotlighting the work of these SDGs in India. So India is committed to reducing emissions intensities of its GDP. That means the more the country produces, it will use less fossil fuels to do that production. It will reduce that intensity by almost 25% by 2020. And it will reduce emissions intensity of its GDP, the amount of, that sounds about the same though. Reduce emissions in, 2030, I'm sorry. So by 2030, that will rise to 35%. So we get these progressive improvements in the metrics here. Going into the COP26 conference, which I'll talk more about after this slide, some of the themes that were coming up as important for the world to consider was mitigation, keeping emissions below 1.5, solidarity with working collaboratively together around the world, and making sure there were real world signals that showed that our shift forward were irreversible. It was irreversible, the work we were doing to install solar panels. It was irreversible, the work we were doing to change our financial system. So I included this slide. It's now a little dated, but still, we have to recapture that sense of hope and optimism as we push forward now. And we have to build this world using and creating, really, tools of international solidarity. We can't just do it. We have to actually create it. It's never existed in the forms that we need it going forward. So COP26 put a spotlight on net zero. And we've seen many more countries step forward now with plans for realizing a net zero future. COP26, again, the conference just held this fall in Glasgow, Scotland, really strengthened for the first time, mobilizing the global finance community to tackle climate change. And we see a lot more attention now being focused on the interconnections between climate and ecosystems. And I'm going to focus on each of these in my presentation today. This is what emissions look like in the world right now. China is the leading emitter, the United States is second in the world, and India is third in the world. If you combine all the European Union countries, they would be third, and India would be fourth in the world. But it gives us a sense of just distribution, and it's a snapshot of the world today. It doesn't show us in this slide the history of how we got here. The United States has been the leading emitter for the world in the history of global emissions. So China leads the US today, but not in total emissions over the history of industrialization. So including the EU as a measure, India here in this slide is positioned as fourth in the world. I wanted to share with you this slide because it shows, using the renewables, what we're trying to achieve with the growth in renewable energy and where we're at in that growth. You can see here that we have already reached this inflection point at the year 2020 in renewables. Not a lot actually has to happen in renewables going forward for us to be successful, according to the IEA's forecast for the 21st century. You can see it's almost a straight line from 2020 forward. We have tremendous momentum in the world around our renewable energy. One of the things we have to shift in terms of these other curves is we want to reduce the subsidies that go into fossil fuels. We can do that slowly enough so that it will not be too disruptive to pricing signals immediately today. But we have to, as a global community, remove the subsidies that go into fossil fuels in order to strengthen the shift to renewable energy in the next 20 years. And we really need to begin that shifting of subsidies immediately. This slide gives us a very nice perspective on our progress and the gap in what we still need to achieve. So the outer circle here starts at where we were in 2010, and then the next lens in says current policies. So we can see there's quite a gap between current policies and 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is our global crisis. This is why climate change is so alarming. We have not solved this problem at all. Even though that last slide is optimistic in terms of the straight line forecast for renewables, we have an emissions gap. We're still too reliant on fossil fuels, and we have to talk about that emissions gap today. I previously introduced similar information to this, but this is just reinforcing this concept of why we need to solve that emissions gap. And if we look at just 1.5 degrees Celsius, it says rising sea levels will displace 46 million people. That's baked in at this point. We're headed to a world of 1.5. Right now, we're really headed to a world of 2 degrees, and that's an optimistic forecast. We could easily exceed 2 degrees. So we're trying, though, we must avoid the 3 and 4 degree scenarios. So this is additional information on that here, showing the impacts of fires getting more and more devastating. The fires are going to be with us for many decades to come. They will be devastating under the least severe climate scenario. At the most severe scenarios could be so devastating, we really shouldn't even want to contemplate them. The same for what would happen to the impacts on food. You can see under 3 degrees Celsius, just to point out one of these gory statistics, local fish species, not all fish species, but local fish species go extinct. Climate change is an extinction event. It is not the only extinction event we face as a species, but it is alone an extinction event if we don't figure our way through this. I think this is, unfortunately, the easiest slide for me to share with you that gives you a complete picture of climate mitigation and where we are right now in the world. So current policies leave us with a world where we are looking at a 2.7 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures. We're getting very close under current policies to that 3 degrees Celsius scenario. If we look forward, though, because this is a moving process, our 2030 targets bring us to a world of 2.5 degrees Celsius. Better, very modestly better, but a long way from 1.5 degrees. If we look at future targets beyond 2030, we see another moderate decrease to 2.1 degrees Celsius. And the most optimistic scenario one could glean from the existing pledges that countries have made right now is that we could be living in a future world of 1.8 degrees Celsius. So our most optimistic projection leaves us just outside that 1.5 degree goal. To understand this a little bit more carefully, the targets that countries have set are divided between conditional targets and unconditional targets. Unconditional targets means, as a nation, we pledge to get this done. Conditional targets means we pledge to get this done, but it will require that we also receive financial support and technical support to get that done. So this is where solidarity becomes so critical. Countries want to be able to accelerate their progress. They literally do not have the financial means. So those measures of the low HDI and the medium HDI countries, those countries need technical support. They need financial support. And the world is starting to respond to that. Another slide showing the emissions gap. I prefer to save some time for comments rather than just plow through more data so we can get even finer grained detail on individual countries. My point in sharing information about the United States is to show that independent analysts rate the United States as quite lacking in certain key attributes. They're critically insufficient in climate finance. They're insufficient in producing their fair share of resources, and existing policies are also listed as insufficient right now. So even in the United States, such a wealthy country, there is so much more that the United States should be doing in the name of solidarity for the world and its own rational future. So this gives you a fuller picture of how countries of the world are ranked in terms of these kind of color-coded schemas of critically insufficient in their commitments to almost sufficient in their resources. So the United States here is insufficient, and India is listed here as highly insufficient. And again, part of the context and quandary for India is how do we secure more external resources in order for us to be able to do this work more effectively. So this is more optimistic information. The countries of the world are springing forward, and they are starting to adopt net zero targets. You can see in 2021, as we were moving into COP26, a whole bunch of countries from Australia to Vietnam adopted net zero targets. They differ in terms of setting that into law or pledging to do that. And in 2020, we also had many countries joining. So the next few years are likely to bring on still a lot more countries into this new world of setting net zero targets. It wasn't that far ago where countries were virtually absent from this board. Now the board is filling up with some speed, and we can also map this across the world according to these various parameters. Again, time doesn't permit more detail on this right now. And this is what the global energy mix would look like under a net zero global supply. And that would place the world at 20% reliance on solar, 16% reliance on wind, 11% reliance on nuclear, 30% reliance on other renewables. And there is still a fair amount of gas, coal, and oil in the mix. But compared to 2020, it's really a radical transformation that the world would have gone through. So this is an optimistic scenario of getting to net zero by 2050. It's a scenario that we should all lean in the direction of this optimism because this is still leading the world with devastating changes. This is not, we're in the clear of climate change. That only leaves us avoiding the most severe consequences that would otherwise happen. This gives us a little bit more information about India. So it says here that by 2070, India will achieve its target of net zero. By 2030, India will reduce its carbon intensity. We saw that in the prior slide. From a previous target of 35, they've now increased that to 45%. So the information I pulled off of a UN website was now incorrect because it changed over just a few months ago going into that COP report. This slide comes from one of so this is the gap in climate finance that I keep referring to. This is what we need the world community to step forward, particularly those high achieving HDI countries. And we have to understand that we are not living as separate countries and separate realities. We share one world, and we need to actually get all the financing of the world to be in a collaborative framework. So we think in terms of nation states as the building block of our governance. It's still true, but we do need a much more enhanced global governance regime. Right now, we're building that collaboratively without, strengthening the UN's regulatory powers. We're left with doing this on a collaborative basis where we just agree that we need to pitch in and help each other. As a result of that, we're also doing this slower than we ought to be doing, given the nature of this crisis. So again, another look at that rating schema, but this time just highlighting the question of climate finance. Here's the United States and Russia, two important superpowers being listed as critically insufficient in their financing. But those high achieving countries on the HDI, Norway, Germany, are listed as insufficient. Switzerland is very high on the HDI. They're listed as highly insufficient. This is unacceptable for the world community. And pressure needs to increase on the governments so they start to expand this international financing. And of course, they have every right to want to make sure that that financing is done in a way where resources are used efficiently without corruption. And we pretty much have to invent new systems of accountability to ensure that. There are definitely bottlenecks here that hold back the financing. So it is not simply issues of greed that are slowing us down. That said, there was some significant positive news that came out of COP26 this past fall. Financial institutions representing $130 trillion in capital, which I think is certainly substantial, have pledged to transform the global economy to net zero in a new Glasgow financial alliance for net zero. The World Bank's International Finance Corp and Europe's largest asset manager, Amundi, established a plan for $2 billion for emerging market sustainable bond funds. More than 100 countries representing 85% of the world's forests and backed by $12 billion in public funds committed to reverse deforestation and land degradation. So one of those mitigation actions is not just to stop the use of fossil fuels, but to plant trees And those trees will be able to absorb the carbon dioxide we've released into the atmosphere. So if we can reverse deforestation and commit to major reforestation efforts done in ecologically sensitive ways, we can't plant trees wherever. They have to be done in places where it's appropriate to plant them. But this can be a major piece of what we do going forward. More than 20 countries and 5 development banks have committed to ending the public financing of overseas fossil fuel projects. We can't keep investing in new fossil fuel projects, and there is movement now to shift away from that outdated thinking. So this is my second slide of kind of looking more carefully at the array of different strategies we can pursue in order to mitigate climate change. I'm going to focus just on one of them, 2 of them here. So reduce food loss. I mentioned drawdown solutions as a resource. They recognize that reducing food loss is, again, one of the most cost-effective strategies the world can pursue right now for climate mitigation. And number 10, related to that, is eating more plants and less meat. As the world gets wealthier, there's a natural desire for people to expand their palettes of what they consume, and that often involves eating more meat. So we've seen a big boost in meat production and consumption. We know that there's been losses in the Amazon rainforest and other places to expand cattle ranching. We need to have a cultural shift in the world now of eating more plants, less meat. This is healthier for us as people, and it's also going to be healthier for the planet. This is what 100% renewable energy looks like from one organization called the Solutions Project. This would involve 12% of that energy coming from rooftop solar, 20% coming from commercial solar plants, much larger solar arrays, 5% coming from concentrating solar plants. So these are solar plants that direct the energy of the sun into a focal point at the center of a large and expensive array. But these are cost-effective renewable energy platforms today. Onshore wind energy would be 37%. Offshore wind would be 6%. And construction jobs from all this would be almost 2 million jobs. The United States profile looks very similar. It's kind of interesting to compare the 2 countries and to see the numbers, orders of magnitude are quite similar in numbers. There's certainly some differences, but less than you might imagine from 2 countries that are so different. So I've talked about climate mitigation and climate financing. Under the what needs to be done, I'd like to wrap up with some slides that focus a little bit more on the reforestation and biodiversity and the connectivity between those 2 topics before we move on to the agency wrap up for the presentation. This is from the World Health Organization, and it's talking about an array of different elements that feed into global biodiversity. And you can see over here, hopefully you see my cursor, that climate change is one of the elements. It's in blue on this screen, and it's one of the elements of among this array of features that feed into planetary biodiversity. I absolutely want to be clear that one of the takeaway messages from my presentation is biodiversity is going to flourish or it's going to perish in our lifetimes. And this is one of the most consequential decisions we as human beings have ever been asked to make as a species. Our future rides on our commitment to biodiversity and understanding that all the news attention on climate change, we ought to have an equal amount of news, perhaps more news focused on planetary biodiversity. The news on biodiversity is starting to increase, but it really is not appropriate to the scale of that crisis. So these are really twin crises And again, the list of crises doesn't stop there. We still have the issue of war. We have the issue of nuclear war. We have many other concerns like COVID that are making our policy arena crowded and kind of difficult to figure out how to move all this forward. But we really need a new kind of policy regime as countries and a global community to move forward with this. And I have a few words to wrap up on that at the very end. So this is a nice slide giving us, some real highlights of connecting climate and biodiversity. We need to recognize under rights and livelihood and respect and safeguard the rights and livelihoods of local and traditional users of ecosystems. This is very much under threat right now. In India, there are many examples of this. In the United States, the same. It is an international problem. We cannot trample on the traditions of minority communities. They are essential to our planet. They are essential to ourselves in terms of human rights. So I'm really glad the slide highlights that among many other issues here. Here, again, diving a little deeper into the topic, are 20 different pathways of natural climate solutions. At the very top, we have reforestation. At the very bottom, we have coastal restoration, peatland restoration, avoiding coastal impacts. Adaptation solutions for a changing climate. Again, looking at the connections in adaptation between biodiversity and climate change. The seas are going to rise. The issue of how much they rise is a function of those carbon emissions and the 1.5 degree target. But do we want to build seawalls? We're going to destroy the coastal ecosystems where we insist on putting up seawalls. Cities are going to need to put up seawalls, but there are vastly larger territories outside of our cities that will also want to construct seawalls. There's good economic reason for why they want to do that, but they're terrible from a biodiversity perspective. So I add that comment as a cautionary comment in terms of people are going to rush to build seawalls. It makes money, it produces jobs, but we have to focus on the biodiversity lens. I want here to come back to the question of interbeing and the relationship between ecology and interbeing. So ecosystem-based solutions have to be front and center as we think about the world. And we want to understand that we're not doing things from a sense of, we need this done for us. We are a co-evolutionary species. We have co-evolved with the species of the planet. And that is where our future lies, unless we're going to become all cyborgs and just dive into the future of the metaverse and technology. Last I checked, we're all breathing mammals. I don't think that I want to be a cyborg. I think I want to stay integrated with ecosystems. I want our world culture to become more embedded in ecosystems and celebrate and protect those ecosystems. I'm going to let this one go. So that brings us to the last section of the presentation. This is a quick wrap up. My students are in a Model UN class, and I'd like to invite the students who are with us today to stay in touch with us. I'll have my email address on my final slide. When we are doing our climate simulations in the future, maybe we could do this in some way as an international climate simulation. If you jot down this title, coming from the United States, you can find a wealth of free resources for conducting classroom simulations about climate action. Students adopt the perspective of different nationalities, and the students have to debate future goals based on their different national attributes. I want to introduce you to another project. I mentioned GNEC earlier. This is the second project I'm involved in. Drawdown East End is Eastern Long Island, the Hamptons. And this very new organization just completed a festival. I presented at that festival with some of my students, and they just posted this yesterday to the YouTube system. So if you go to Drawdown East End or Southampton Arts Center, you'll be able to see what I did with those students. Part of the project of Drawdown East End is they have a carbon crew project, a second invitation. I invite you to work with me as carbon crew members. The goal here is to form small groups of people who commit to reducing our carbon footprint. It's a 5-week program, an hour a week, and you look at your transportation, you look at your home, you look at your consumption. There's a little bit of reading attached to this. There's some discussion in these weekly meetings. We can do it over Zoom. And the goal of Carbon Crew is for the people who graduate from Carbon Crew to then start their own carbon crews with groups of 5 or 6 people. And that this can, in fact, be seeded around the world as a new strategy for reducing our climate impacts and expanding our education, our empowerment, and our agency, and of course, our solidarity. So it really couldn't be simpler. All you have to do is say, yes, reach out to me. I'd like to start a carbon crew in India, and I'll get some people together. I can't do that immediately in the semester, but I can do that in May or June or July. We'll find the right time to do that. This is what New York City's doing. This comes from their report on a 1.5 degree future. And I just grabbed these images from different parts of their report. But they understand that by reducing injuries from bicycling, there'll be more people who get on bicycles. By improving air quality, that makes the air easier to breathe, and there'll be more people on bicycles, and people's overall health will improve. And by mitigating heat island effects, doing things like planting trees in the city, they're going to make the city more comfortable when the future heat waves hit us. And they are going to hit us, and I know they're going to hit you in India as well. So, the city lens is so important for the world, and cities can do a tremendous amount. So the individual has agency, the city has agency, independent of all of these international efforts. So I want to conclude with the social progress index. You've been a great audience. I know this. This is the most slides I've ever compiled in any presentation. So thank you for your patience. I try to do things a little slower than this, but there's so much information to share. The social progress index ignores economics. It's a fascinating little project they've created. It focuses on basic human needs, access to nutrition, access to sanitation. It focuses on the foundations of well-being, education, wellness, basic environmental quality. And it focuses on opportunity, protecting people's personal rights, and making sure that society is inclusive. Those are the simple ways that they frame their integration of their project as an NGO working on the international UN SDGs. And their director, Michael Green, put together a wonderful TED Talk in 2015. He said, Norway is at the top of the list in the HDI world. So they're also at the top of the list in terms of the social progress index that they independently create. So, it'd be great if everybody could be a Norway. But the world of 2015 was at a ranking of 61. You can see at the very low end of international rankings, Central African Republic was at 31. But really, to achieve the SDGs, what the world needed to do was to boost its average from 61 to 75. It's absolutely a stretch. It's going to be a tough ride to get there, but we can absolutely get there, is the message that Michael Green delivered in this presentation. And it's the mission of this social progress index to get us there. So here's the world of 2015, ranking of 61. You see the dotted line indicating the future goal of 75. There's an x-axis here. So the world average GDP was just under $20,000 in 2015. But the dotted line for global goals means it doesn't matter what the world's income is. We want to go vertically on this scale. And the question is, how do we get that vertical lift? This is that speaker, Michael Green, and he points to Costa Rica. Here's Costa Rica performing well above international norms on the vertical axis. So India doesn't need a lot more income to achieve what Costa Rica has achieved in terms of income. What India needs to do is India needs to move vertically on the social progress index. The United States is a very high achieving country in GDP, but we don't perform as well as we should in terms of social progress. Like India, the United States needs to have a focus on the vertical lens. And as a country, we're obsessed with the x-axis. I know in India, there's a lot of love for the x-axis as well, but it's the y-axis, the social progress index. That's where our future solidarity work needs to focus on. So hopefully we can all commit to finding ways in our own lives as individuals, family members, and future professionals for the students, where you align your life work with achieving improvements in the social progress. Never doubt that your individual efforts are going to matter for the world. It's the only way we're going to make this change is by each of us making these commitments. So to wrap up, we're not going to get these significant improvements in the social progress lens, the vertical height on those graphs, using the same old methods. Gender is actually one of the crucial leverage points we have to create a sustainable world. Rianne Eisler has done some wonderful work, and she's kind of crafted this perspective called creating a world of partnerism, or as it's listed here, the partnership system. It's a world that's democratic. It's a world that's more equitable. It definitely values the female and the male equally, and the feminine and the masculine that's in each of us equally. It's mutual respect for all. It's a low degree of violence world. We have created a world under the partnership system where the types of violence we see are no longer not only not tolerated, but not necessary. We've simply shifted our mind. For me, this is a beautiful embodiment of global solidarity and global interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh's wonderful phrase. And how do we do this? We do this through the stories we tell to each other. So I invite you to have a listen to Michael Green's story, and I invite you to hear how he wants to craft from his mind a future that I think aligns nicely with Rianne Eisler's vision of partnerism. So we're back here now at the top, a little over an hour from our start. We have a few minutes for questions, which is amazing on my end that I skillfully navigated 70 slides in an hour and a little bit. But I put the red star next to solidarity because it's going to be fantastically fun to explore how we build this international solidarity together, working with UNDP as a kind of expert guide, but all of us working together, getting to know each other. And I totally welcome your questions and comments now. I want to share with you, I've been invited to join a very special group of people called the Evolutionary Leaders. And I invite you to check out their website. And I'm super delighted that, totally independent of anything I've ever done, they too are looking at this context of interbeing as being very vital for how to guide the world forward. I've been asked to join them specifically to help advance the achievement in the UN SDGs. And I think they're meeting today. I think I'm supposed to be in a meeting at noon today with them. I don't know if I can physically manage that with my other schedule, but this is an ongoing project, and I shouldn't say ongoing. It's a brand new project, not evolutionary leaders, but the SDG work. And I would love to get your input into that I could feed to these valued partners in terms of how we get more leverage to advance the SDGs, and whether you agree with me that partnerism is the way to go. So please learn a little bit more about Rianne Eisler's work. She's a prolific author, and she's in her 80s now. So we want to make our best use of her availability to us while she's still so vitally involved in this work. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It took several hours of effort to put this together yesterday. So I hope you've gotten your fair share of learning from this. And we have some time left over now, I think, for some questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your valuable lecture. We can now understand.
I think you're still muted, Doctor.
Yes. I have one question. Can
Dr.
I ask?
Adja, I think you're still muted.
Oh, okay.
I'm not hearing you.
Yes.
There we go. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Doctor, for your valuable lecture. And
thank you.
Yes, we now understand what climate change is, and what part should we take in future. And you were talking about carbon clue project. Please give us some clues that we can take important role in this project or do some work for this project.
Yeah, so I'm going to type into the chat evolutionaryleaders.net. It's easy to find them online. And then if you type in drawdown East End, I think you'll immediately find that organization as well. So Carbon Crew is just a click. Their whole curriculum is online. You don't need me to do it. It's super simple. It's, what are some things that you would like to do by 2030 or 2035 that will lower your future use of transportation, whatever that is. I'm going to live close to my job and I'll be able to walk to my job. I'm going to use public transportation more, or I'm going to create a carpool. Whatever it is that's going to be your form of agency, you create that for yourself. They do connect to these simple online tools to measure ecological footprints. So you start the course measuring your ecological footprint, and you end the course measuring your future ecological footprint, and you can see how you're doing. So like the HDI graphics I showed, can the whole world live like you on one planet? I would need the world to have 4 planets. It's actually a little less than that. 4 planets to live like me in New York, right? That's our kind of absurd way of living in New York, that if everybody lived like me, driving a car, etc., the world would need 4 planet Earths to live sustainably. So the way I live, the way my neighbors live, the way my country lives, it's really it's insulting to the other inhabitants, human inhabitants. It's obscenely upsetting to the non-human inhabitants of how little where I can leave for others. So my personal pledge to all of you is I will keep chipping away at that ecological footprint. I'm going to learn to get to net zero in my own lifestyle. I'm going to be an advocate for wind power where I live on Long Island. I'm going to be an advocate for strengthening public transportation where I live. And I'm going to keep working as long as I can find beautiful partners such as yourselves. I'll keep working at the international level and working at the UN to strive for an equitable world for us all. So what I'm asking all of you to make pledges, even a simple pledge. Make a pledge in the chat that you will go to the UNDP website and take a more careful look at the report they just released. So UNDP, new report. What are your pledges? Share here, please. And you can also unmute yourself and share with us with audio if you'd like. I'd love for a couple of students to share during our presentation. I know students are a little shy, but my students are actually a decent number of our participants. So I'm going to call one student out who I work a little more closely with. Julian, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, everybody.
Good morning. Could you share a comment on your own sense of, one future pledge you'd like to make?
Sure, absolutely. So this, right. So my goal is to work in renewable energy as a career path, and in the more near future, this summer I have an internship with a nonprofit that works for affordable housing. And my role this summer is going to be integrating renewable energy into the new affordable housing builds. So that's probably my goal for the upcoming future.
Excellent. Excellent. That's fantastic. Dr. Aja, would you like to suggest that one of your students, or maybe you'd like to share a pledge?
Yes, doctor.
Hi.
Yes. I prepared a pledge on urban green space, and more than 400 people from 50 countries responded to this pledge. And it is linked with Google Drive, and I can understand their perception about the urban green space.
That's fantastic. And you've also added a link to that in our chat for everybody to see. And my students will definitely be chatting about that in our classroom next week. And we'll get you some feedback after we have that discussion. So you'll hear from us on Long Island in the United States about your wonderful pledge on the Google form. Thank you so much for sharing. So we have a few more minutes. How would you like to use that time, Dr. Adya?
Yes.
Do you have anything else you'd like to ask me based on what I've presented?
I don't have any question. If other participants have any question, they can ask you. And you are the terrific speaker, and you know very well about climate change. You explained very well. So it is our great opportunity to have you with us today. So
Thank you.
participants, they if you have any question, please ask him.
Yes, the floor is open.
Yes. You can use the chat box.
I'm going to ask Sage if she's able to unmute.
Yes.
And I'd love for my student Sage to share a couple of thoughts, either a comment about the presentation or your own ideas about a future pledge, or a question for Dr. Aja, who's here with us from India. Maybe a question about urban green spaces. Sorry to put you on the spotlight, Sage, but you seem to be quick on your feet.
That's okay, no worries. Yeah, I guess I do kind of wonder about green spaces because I did a paper about that for Model UN. So I was wondering, is that something that's being implemented by you? Like, is that something that is becoming increasingly popular?
Thank you.
Is that being implemented? How does the pledge process work? Could you share a little more information about it, Dr. Aja?
Yes.
What's your vision for that urban green space project? What do you hope will happen in the next few years?
Yes, I am doing the perception survey. Then the people who are giving wrong answer, then I will share the right answers so that they can know what should be the right answer.
So why don't you and I chat a little bit about this issue? I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the capital city of Delhi, and I certainly got the sense that there were some beautiful park spaces, but there is probably a deficit of park spaces. There probably needs to be a greater investment in park spaces, especially in some of the communities where there's a real need, the lower income communities. Could you share your sense of how some of the cities, maybe the city you live in, are trying to ignore that issue or actually transform that issue? Where is city government with that in your home city?
Yes, my nearest city is Kolkata.
Uh-huh.
Kolkata in West Bengal. People are really thinking about the air pollution in the big cities. They are doing plantation in their gardens, in their homes, but that is not sufficient to overcome the situation. And the Delhi, the capital city of India, is really polluted, and many people are taking many actions to reduce the pollution level.
And expanding the parks would be a wonderful success. People would have access to the quiet of the parks, the greenery of the
Yes.
parks, and it would help with the air pollution as well.
Mm.
So I totally agree with you that is a wonderful strategy, an excellent ecosystem-based approach. If you can build a network of parks that have some, a corridor value, so a cyclist or a jogger could have several miles of parks. It is a wonderful asset that many of our cities in the United States have. And I'm sure there's opportunities for urban planners, for example, in New York City, where they do such wonderful work, to collaborate with larger cities in India like Calcutta. And that would be another way to build international solidarity. So earlier this semester, the students were reading a author, Benjamin Barber, who's an advocate for a world parliament of mayors. And so this is a way for the major cities of the world to be in direct communication and to share an agenda, to share information, and really build international solidarity. So I'd invite you to share that with your audiences. I'm not going to get the wording of this exactly right, but it's a world parliament of mayors. And the author that we read, somebody who was an advocate for this, was Benjamin Barber. This might be a good time to wrap up. We're just a few minutes shy of the top of the hour, but unless there's other questions, I can certainly hold the floor here. Let me check in the chat window and see if any questions came up. So we have greetings from Ethiopia. Can the whole world live like you on one planet, was my question. I had asked earlier about what is it that you think about for security. Dr. Ajay, you wrote food, clothes, housing, education, and jobs. And Mr. Rashid wrote, human security is safety from the threat of natural calamities resulting in mass death. That's certainly a very, very important issue. Noah wrote, my definition of being secure is having access to vital resources such as food and water, and being able to maintain a decently high earning job for myself and my family, in addition to a quality education. And Sarah wrote, it pertains to freedoms and rights available to myself and the members of my community, as certain members are faced with the inability to access universal securities based on low income or other barriers. Any other final comments from our audience today? You're a very
Julian,
attentive audience, but quiet audience. You
Julian
have the
raised
floor,
her
audience.
hand.
What's that?
Julian raised her hand.
Ah, Julian raised the hand. Julian, could you have something to share?
Yeah, I wanted to ask. So I don't know a lot about Indian politics, and so I don't know about this one. But I know in America, like sometimes we get frustrated that there's not this kind of support for the goals we want at a governmental level. How is the support there?
Dr. Aja, could you share a little bit about the current politics supporting climate initiatives right now? Are you hopeful that India has turned a corner and is being vigorous?
Yes.
Excellent. The issue of coal is very important to your country.
Yes.
It's vital for your electric grid, but the country is making some initial movements in the direction of moving away from coal. And there's certainly been major investments in the solar industry. So how do you see the solar industry? Do you see a lot of solar panels? And has your university invested in solar panels?
Yes. Our colleges and universities are now investing on solar energy, and the national accreditation level, where colleges and universities are given ranks on their activities. If these institutions do invest in solar energy, and they get grant from the government level or also from international organizations, and they get good marks in their ranking, so from the government level these practices are always they are encouraging this type of practices. So they are this type of practices initiated in our country. So we are trying to do solar panels. We use solar panels in our institutions, and these practices, we, other than academic activities, we also have to look after these green energy practices. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you again for the opportunity for my students to meet you this morning and for me to be able to present to your audience. I have recorded today, hopefully successfully, and I'll make a copy of that recording available to you so you can also share this with your community.
Yes.
And I look forward to future engagements with you.
Yes.
So if there's a way for some of your students to work on a climate simulation later in the semester, you can feel free to email me. And I've also invited our audience today to think about other resources like Drawdown East End.
Yes. Thank you, Doctor.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to call us officially closed. I'm going to stop the recording. Yes. And wish you all a good evening in India.
Recording
and a
stopped.
Good day for my students. Thank you all.
Doctor. Have a nice day.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
dear participants, for your valuable time. Thank you.
Yes.
Have a nice
yes.
day.
Thank you all. Bye.